Sports Talk Chicago. Here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's the host of the Bet the Board podcast and a sports betting analyst for CBS Sports and Fox Bet Live. Please welcome Todd Fuhrman to the program. Todd, it's great to have you on. How are you?
I'm doing very well this week, John. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thanks for being here. Which team busted your bracket this year?
It depends. I can't lie here. I fill out two brackets, one where I normally go with my original train of thought, and then one where I try and go a little bit off the path. And honestly, the one where I went off the beaten path this season seemed to be well positioned until UCLA threw a wrench into things. I actually went with Alabama playing Gonzaga in the Final Four. That's what threw things off and put me behind the eight ball. So I will not be finishing in the money in any of the office pools that I entered into with a couple of my buddies.
How much did it cost you?
It cost me a chunk of change. Now, thankfully, it didn't cost me enough money where I'll be worrying about my next meal or how the mortgage will get paid this month. But always better to make money than it is to lose. Let's put it that way. Albeit we know these bracket pools are a lot more like a sports betting lottery ticket than they are anything else.
What was the biggest surprise to you in the tournament so far?
I mean, I think I'll take the low-hanging fruit. And when you look at UCLA, a team that a lot of us wrote off amid some of their injury concerns coming into the tournament, they finished the regular season, if you include the Pac-12 conference tournament as well, with 4 straight losses. And they get down double digits in the first half against Michigan State. But to Mick Cronin's credit, Johnny Juzang and the rest of the Bruins, they weren't going to be denied in that game. Now, if you'd have told me they would make this kind of run and become only the second 11 seed to get to the Final Four, mirroring what we saw from VCU back in 2011, I probably would have laughed. But I guess the other team that has to be a disappointment would be the local boys in Illinois, a team that was poised to make a deep run. Wasn't the most favorable draw taking on Loyola in the second round. But at the same time, if you're going to be the national champs, you have to go out there and beat the teams in front of you. And Illinois looked ill-equipped to deal with anything Porter Moser threw in their direction in the round of 32.
You know, Todd, with that upset factor, like in Illinois' case, or UCLA going to the Final Four, how tough is it to bet March Madness?
You know what? From some of the stuff that I've seen, professional bettors have actually had a pretty good tournament. They've been quick to gravitate towards a lot of these unders that we saw in the round of 16 into the Elite Eight. When you look at some of the teams that they've had undervalued, it's amazing that a team like UCLA, a lot of us thought could be a dark horse to get to the Final Four before the season started. And of course, things didn't go according to plan. But if you look at some of the folks' power numbers, that was one of the bigger positions I'd seen, with them taking 7.5 on the open, that number coming down to 6.5. And while it looked like the Wolverines could find a lead early in the game, I mean, the outcome from a point spread perspective wasn't really in doubt. So as far as some of the other teams that have gone, I mean, Michigan took money against them throughout the course of the tournament, albeit it didn't exactly pay dividends against the likes of Florida State or LSU. But all in all, I think the general public has had a little bit of a struggle trying to wrap their head around some of the parity we've seen in college basketball. And oftentimes that means plans are going out as expected for some of the professional bettors.
Todd Fuhrman here on Sports Talk Chicago. Todd, how surprised were you by the Big Ten showing in general?
I think it's one of the $100 million questions that we have coming out of here. And for me, I don't worry about the Wisconsins and Rutgers. If they make deep runs, hey, it's great to show the league depth. But when you have Ohio State going down to Oral Roberts, you have Illinois bounced out early on in the tournament, and I guess to a lesser extent the Iowa Hawkeyes, they were a team that I wasn't all that enamored with throughout the course of the season. It's definitely disappointing because we thought that was the best league top to bottom. But it's the age-old question, John. Do they beat each other up and show some of the wear and tear when you get into the tournament? Or are they just a beneficiary of beating up on one another and not really matching up with the rest of the national landscape? I do have to say that if you'd have told me that the Pac-12 would have this kind of success, I probably would have laughed at you. Thought they were slightly undervalued, but didn't in my wildest dreams believe that Oregon State and UCLA were capable of these kind of deep runs.
Does all this reflect a problem to you in the selection process? Should something be changed?
I won't go that far. I do think the committee's gotten a lot better in terms of the use of analytics and some of the projections that are out there, whether it's leaning on odds makers or looking at some of the tools that are widely available, specifically like KenPom, that has become more or less the Bible for in-depth studies in college basketball teams. But you're always going to have a case like a team like Loyola, who probably should have been seated on that 5 or 6 line, given their body of work. They couldn't have been higher, in my opinion, just because they didn't have the resume to warrant it being in those protected seeds 1 through 4. So every now and again you'll have an outlier, but I don't think even the most devout college basketball fan, anyone in the selection committee, could have imagined that Wayne Tinkle's team would have gelled the way they had, or again, UCLA could put together this improbable run, because if anyone saw it coming, they would have been hammering the Bruins on the money line every opportunity they had. Not quite sure folks are going to be so bullish walking to the window with a Bruins ticket with them catching 14 against Gonzaga in the Final Four.
Who wins the tournament this year?
Gonzaga was my pick before the dance, and I can't really waver from that. They've done nothing to dissuade me thinking that this team has a vulnerability somewhere. Sure, if they match up against Baylor in the national championship, potentially the trio of guards in Teague, Butler, and company and Mitchell could provide some problems. But I think when you watch Gonzaga, their defense is a little bit underrated. We saw them really stymie USC for the better part of a half until the game was clearly decided and they got a little loose on the defensive end. Meanwhile, offensively, every time you watch them, you just have to be blown away with how unselfish they are sharing the basketball. And whether it's Drew Timme dominating in the paint, Corey Kispert getting hot from the outside, or Jalen Suggs facilitating from the perimeter, you see the level of talent that they have at nearly every position, and it makes them a tough team to pick against, bet against, what have you. I do think when you talk about Gonzaga getting into a potential national championship game against Baylor, that's where Jalen Suggs maybe needs to be a little bit more selfish with the basketball and look to be as dynamic a scorer as he is a facilitator, because they'll deal with a level of physicality facing the Bears that they haven't seen probably since the non-conference schedule.
Todd Fuhrman, you're on Sports Talk Chicago. Todd, are you a fan of the NFL's new game for next year?
From a betting perspective, I think anytime you can add an NFL game to the inventory that's already increasing, it's a good thing. If I was a player out there, probably not. It's another 60 minutes of wear and tear and putting on my body. And when you talk about not giving these teams a second bye week, what that'll look like in a league known for attrition more so than anything else, I think a lot of these franchises will have their depth further tested than what they normally see. I guess when I look at the sports calendar, the one thing that you do worry about is how much deeper we're going to go into the month of February to get NFL football, because Mother Nature will play a bigger role. And I don't think it's going to impact negatively teams like the Bears or Packers who are used to playing in cold weather. But when you have playoffs starting later in January, it could put an even bigger premium on trying to get that number one seed in the respective conferences and make sure you have that all too valuable home field advantage, especially if you're a team hailing from a dome or a warm weather climate.
Does the new game mean the Bears lose one more next year?
Well, I mean, you guys have Andy Dalton. He's QB1, so there's a lot to be excited about in Chicago, because clearly the Bears have a positive trajectory. You know what? The Bears get the benefit of taking on one of the lesser teams added to their schedule, so who knows? Maybe it could be an extra win, but I think a lot of people that bleed for the Monsters of the Midway have to try and figure out if Matt Nagy is going to be their guy, what direction this franchise wants to go, and the level of frustration continues to become apparent as the Bears misstep every which way when it comes to finding that elusive franchise quarterback.
Let me ask you this. Have you ever seen a team sign a quarterback and have their Super Bowl odds get worse?
It's definitely only happened a handful of times. I've seen a lot of teams have their Super Bowl odds stay about the same, but this does come with a little bit of a caveat. I think this story was pretty entertaining when it was out there. The reason those Bears odds to win the Super Bowl came down is because bookmakers had to protect against the possibility that maybe the Bears were going to land Russell Wilson, or they could have brought in Deshaun Watson, or a quarterback that would have raised their overall profile. So I think the pricing, more or less at 50-1, would have assumed the likes of a Nick Foles leading the team, a re-signing of Mitchell Trubisky, or in this case, the Red Rifle coming in there to try and put his thumbprints all over what Bears football is.
What's your expectation for him, if anything?
I think when you look at the division, we know the Lions are constantly in rebuild mode, so if the Bears should be able to finish above them. But from a talent standpoint, top to bottom, I think the Bears are the third best team. I'm interested to see what Minnesota will look like with that young defense having another year to understand what Coach Zimmer's system is. You could tell that they were out of sync early on in the season. Getting the likes of Danielle Hunter should change things quite a bit. And if the Vikings can stay healthy, suddenly they're a lot better on that side of the ball, where offensively I think they'll pick up right where they left off with a trio of skill position guys in Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, and of course, Dalvin Cook to carry the ball out of the backfield. The Packers, they're my $100 million question because you know that I haven't been a huge fan of what we've seen from them the last couple of seasons. I think they've well outperformed their metrics. But if Aaron Rodgers plays as well as he did a year ago, I'm not going to discount them. But clearly the Bears, unless something drastic changes, should pencil themselves in for a third-place finish in the NFC North.
Do you have a record prediction?
It's so hard to kind of do that now until we see exactly how the 17 weeks will lay out. As you know, one of the big things to try and look for is when the Bears will get the right teams coming in dealing with cold weather. Will they play 3 games in a row on the road? From an overall talent standpoint, as things stand right now, I think setting realistic expectations for the Bears right around 7-10 feels like a very fair threshold.
Could that fire Pace and Nagy, do you think, or not?
Well, the fact that Pace still has a job is a little bit head-scratching for me. So he must have photos on some prominent members of the McCaskey family to kind of maintain his stranglehold on the general manager position. I do think that if this team struggles and misses the playoffs, both guys will be gone. I think the Bears would be smart to bring in a general manager who can bring in a head coach that fits his mold, and the two of them can work in harmony with one another, because right now it appears that these two couldn't be more diametrically opposed, and they both know that the success and longevity that they can have as members of the Bears organization, those two will be inextricably linked at the hip.